We're back to watching Rome by HBO and commenting on each separate scene, talking about all our favorite historical elements in this amazing series. We are now starting with the fifth episode of the first season, which is called The Ram Has Touched the Wall. First, about this title. Clearly, it's a metaphor about an impeding siege or an assault, the beginning of an attack, maybe, and this gives us the idea that something monumental is about to happen here. I do not remember what happens in this episode particularly, so it's gonna be interesting even for me. And with that, let's get past the intro and onto the first scene. And the first scene is at Pompey's camp, where the losing circle of Pompey has decided to finally surrender to Caesar because there's no other choice. Things are looking very bleak for the Pompeians, and a curious detail to note, while they're writing their letter of surrender, Pompey dictates, Caesar, I have decided to concede to you. At which point he gets interrupted by Cicero, who says that it shouldn't say, I have decided to concede. Instead, it should say, the Senate and people of Rome have authorized me to concede to you. Now, this, in my opinion, is a very poignant touch on the part of the filmmakers, because they're showing how the bullshittery of the Roman Republic worked. In this case, in history, the battle between Caesar and Pompey, the mainstream media of the time would have us believe that Caesar was a tyrant and Pompey was a man of the people who was trying to save the Republic from a dictator. And this one line by Pompey, I have decided to concede, is kind of a Freudian slip. It immediately gives away the fact that there's no such thing as a person who's trying to save the Republic and a person who's trying to destroy it. They are both just power-hungry assholes. None of them actually cares about the people or the Republic. And the political machine, by the use of linguistic propaganda bullshit, is trying to mask it up as if there's a good guy and a bad guy. Much like the political machine of today, might I add. And then while they argue about how humiliating this is for them, because of the fact that they have to surrender, Pompey bursts out saying this isn't surrender. In his view, it's just a clever trick to buy them time, and then trap and destroy Caesar later on. Which, okay, buddy, if you say so. And the fact that you're screaming it out loud is not at all telling about how you're just more like trying to convince yourself than others. Great acting, by the way, from Pompey's actor. He's awesome. Just like in Caesar's case, the actor is not what I imagined a historical person to have been, but he still acts the hell out of it anyway, and makes up for it. In the next scene, we switch over to Caesar, who is apparently organizing his army somewhere outside Rome, and we can tell by the fact that they're standing near one of the ancient aqueducts near the city. I was there back a few years ago, and I think we went to the same place. I can't be certain as to whether this is the absolute same aqueduct, but where we were was like in a park. I think it was somewhere around the Via Appia, the ancient sacred way. And the aqueduct is in a huge park where people just go for walks and jogging. And of course, in ancient times, since the city was much smaller, this place would have been outside the city walls, somewhere on the outskirts. And what I love about the fact that they filmed there is that they're pretending to be ancient people, but the aqueduct is actually ancient. And if we make this kind of mental exercise of juxtaposing the historical ages of the modern people in the scene and the ancient ruin in the background, it gets really interesting. Think about it. This is modern people pretending to be in the ancient world. Well, then, if we really pretend we're going back in time, then this would mean that the buildings around us should also have to go back to their ancient state. Which means the ancient aqueduct would have to look like it was built maybe just a century ago, something like this. It should not look so weathered, and maybe it should be encased in an outer layer of better stone or something. But of course, we can't do that. And we have this weird juxtaposition of two things people pretending to be in antiquity, but then the ruin behind them has ancient weathering as well, which means then that in their reality, the aqueduct should be doubly ancient. It's kind of an awesome historical inception that we have in this scene, and I love it. It's the same situation as in, at some point, I was reading some ancient Egyptian resources original sources from like 3000 BCE or whatever it was. And in those sources, they're mentioning how they've discovered some quote unquote ancient ruins of buildings and are examining them, which would mean that those were ancient Egyptian archaeologists in ancient Egypt, which is like twice as ancient as Rome. There were archaeologists. They lived thousands of years ago, and they were excavating stuff which, in their time, was already ancient. Words cannot describe how much I adore this kind of historical fuckery. And it was the same with that famous quote by Ovid, I think it was, the poet from the Augustan regime, who said, "Let other people praise ancient times. I am glad I was born in these." And he said those words 20 centuries ago. To me, trying to assimilate this information is just an experience that is both painful and infinitely enjoyable. Oh, and it, by the way, makes me think of a more recent brain hiccup that I had. Like a couple days ago, I saw a video of Henry Kissinger. He's turned 100 years old at this point. And my brain was like, all of a sudden, in like a weird flash, presented me with the comparison of the following. Marilyn Monroe died in 1962, so 61 years ago, which is like a lifetime. And when she died, she was 36, which is more or less middle aged, close to like 40. So she died 61 years ago, at which point she was getting somewhat old, and yet Henry fucking Kissinger was born 3 years before her. He is 3 years older than she was, and he is still alive. That piece of shit is alive and older than a woman who died middle-aged 61 years ago. I thought about this randomly the other day, and it made me look at the ceiling for like 5 minutes before I could move on with my life. this is why I love history. The sheer amount of time and the insane juxtapositions you can make. Very few things in life can fascinate me as much as this. Anyway, I got distracted. In the scene with Caesar outside of Rome, we learn that more and more people formerly from Pompey's camp are now defecating, are now defecting to Caesar and abandoning Pompey. So we're shown the mastery of Caesar when it comes to marketing and populism. His method was that he can get more people on his side by buying them off instead of killing them. And he was correct in this assumption, but then also he died because of it. Because he failed to think about the fact that among so many people you've bought off, you cannot just assume that the whole bunch of them would be absolutely not willing to try and kill you at some point. And so Posca says to Caesar that their money is all spent because of all the bribes they're giving out. And Caesar says it's worth it because it buys him a throne. And I really like what happens next. Posca cuts him off saying, "Throne?" in a baffled way, as if it's some kind of a blasphemy. And Caesar looks at him annoyed and says it's just a poetic license. And I just love it. You see how all of them have silently made this pact to keep the Republic alive only in a verbal way. But no matter how pathetic this way of preservation is, they've agreed to follow it fanatically. Oh, Rome has no kings. How can you say such a vile thing? It's not a throne, I'm just kidding. I'm just gonna take all the reins of power and do whatever the fuck I want, but I'm not a king, please, this is the Republic of the People. And then in the next hilarious exchange, Posca says to Caesar that Atia has invited him to dinner again, and Caesar gets annoyed because she invites him so often, and he just keeps cutting her off. And Posca says, that's not very wise, but it's brave, talking about Atia as if she's some kind of a shark, which, wink wink, we know she's a perfect angel. And Caesar snaps back, saying that he doesn't need to explain himself to Atia, which, man, in this version of ancient Rome, Hades would have to explain himself to Atia. And on this funny note, let's cut the recording here. We'll continue next time with episode 5, part 2.